Sergeant Jessica Langford had always been the pride of her family. After spending 2 years on a peacekeeping mission in a war-torn country, she was finally returning home to the quiet suburb of Clayton, Texas. Her family had always been supportive of her military career, and the town's small, tight-knit community had welcomed her back with open arms. As she stepped off the bus at the Clayton bus station, the weight of her military uniform felt heavy, but it also brought a sense of relief. She was home. The long months away were finally behind her. Her family home was a short drive away, nestled on a peaceful street lined with old oak trees. Jessica's younger brother, Kyle, was waiting for her on the front porch. They hadn't seen each other in over 2 years, and she couldn't help but smile as he ran up to hug her. "Welcome back, Jess," Kyle said, pulling her into a tight embrace. He was the last member of her family she expected to see. He had always been quiet, somewhat withdrawn, but today he seemed different, almost colder. "Thanks, Kyle. It's good to be back," Jessica replied, taking in his familiar face. But there was something off about his expression, an unease that Jessica couldn't quite place. They entered the house together, and Jessica was greeted by her mother, Carol, who had decorated the house with balloons and banners. "Welcome home, sweetie," she said, her face glowing with happiness. "We've missed you so much." Jessica smiled, embracing her mother tightly. It felt good to be surrounded by family again, but Kyle's coldness lingered in the back of her mind. As they sat down for a celebratory dinner, she noticed him staring at her from across the table. His gaze wasn't warm. It was unsettling. The evening went by with awkward silences and strained smiles. Carol tried to keep the conversation light, but Kyle's lack of enthusiasm made it difficult to enjoy the reunion. After dinner, Jessica excused herself to go upstairs and unpack. She needed to unwind after a long journey. Kyle didn't follow her like he usually did. Instead, she heard him retreat to his room. She thought nothing of it. He was probably just tired. Later that night, after a long shower and a hot cup of tea, Jessica finally settled into her old bed. The familiar scent of the house, the creak of the wooden floors, all brought a sense of comfort. She closed her eyes, ready for the deep sleep she'd been craving for months. But before she could drift off, she heard a soft knock on her door. "Come in," Jessica said, thinking it was her mother. The door opened slowly, and in stepped Kyle. His face was pale, and his eyes were filled with an emotion Jessica couldn't quite place. Guilt? Anger? His posture was tense, his hands clenched at his sides. "Is everything okay, Kyle?" Jessica asked, sitting up in bed. Kyle didn't respond immediately. He closed the door behind him and walked over to where Jessica was sitting. "You've changed," he said quietly, his voice almost a whisper. Jessica frowned. "What do you mean?" "I've been away for 2 years, Kyle. Of course I've changed." He shook his head, his jaw tightening. "You've changed in a way I don't understand. You're different." Jessica's heart began to race. She had no idea what he was talking about. "Kyle, I don't know what you're trying to say." Kyle's eyes flashed with something dark, something frightening. He took a deep breath, his hands shaking. "I know what you are. I know the truth." Jessica froze. "What are you talking about?" Kyle's face twisted with disgust. "You think I don't know? You think I don't see it? You're not the same person you used to be. You're a lesbian. You're sick. You've betrayed this family." The words hit Jessica like a slap in the face. She had always known Kyle struggled with her sexuality, but she never imagined it would lead to this. "Kyle," she said, her voice trembling, "this is who I am. You have to accept it." Kyle's face turned red with fury. "I'll never accept it. You've shamed this family. You think you can come back here after what you've done? After everything you've become?" Jessica stood up, her hands shaking as she tried to calm him down. "Kyle, please. You don't understand. It's just who I am. I've always been this way. I didn't choose it." Kyle's eyes were wide with rage now. "I don't care. You're not welcome here anymore." He stepped closer, his fist clenched. "Kyle, stop," Jessica said, trying to maintain her composure. "Please, let's talk about this. This isn't the way to handle it." But Kyle was beyond reasoning. He stepped forward with a violent movement, shoving Jessica back onto the bed. "You're nothing but a disgrace," he yelled. In that moment, Jessica realized the situation was escalating beyond her control. Kyle was dangerous. his anger, his hatred. It was all consuming him. She backed away, her heart racing as Kyle advanced, his eyes wild. Before she could react, Kyle pulled something from behind his back. It was a knife, glinting in the dim light. Jessica's heart stopped. "You don't belong here," Kyle spat, his voice low and trembling. "And I'm going to make sure you never come back." The blade gleamed under the dim light of Jessica's bedroom, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Her breath caught in her throat as she backed away instinctively, her heart racing. Kyle's eyes were wide with a mixture of anger and something darker, something that Jessica couldn't quite comprehend. He was no longer her quiet, withdrawn younger brother. The man standing before her seemed almost unrecognizable, consumed by a violent rage that terrified her. "Kyle, please," Jessica said, her voice trembling. "Put the knife down. You don't have to do this." Kyle didn't respond. His hand shook, but his grip on the knife remained steady. He stepped forward, his face twisted with a hatred that Jessica couldn't understand. She had known her brother was struggling with her sexuality, but she had never imagined it could lead to this. They had fought before, yes, but nothing like this. Jessica tried to stay calm, trying to reason with him, but there was something in his eyes that told her he was beyond reasoning. Her mind raced as she scrambled to make sense of the situation, but there was no time. The distance between them had closed, and Kyle was upon her. Suddenly, in an explosive movement, Kyle lunged forward, and before Jessica could react, the sharp edge of the knife cut across her arm. She screamed in pain, stumbling backward. Blood poured from the wound, staining the fabric of her shirt as she tried to shield herself. "You should never have come back," Kyle spat, his voice low and filled with venom. "You don't belong here. You're an abomination." Jessica's breath came in shallow gasps as she pressed her hand to the gash in her arm. The pain was intense, but her mind was clear. She had to get away from him. She had to survive. Summoning all her strength, Jessica pushed herself to her feet, her vision blurry with pain and fear. Kyle was coming at her again, the knife raised high. She ducked instinctively, narrowly avoiding the blade as it slashed through the air above her. Her heart raced as she looked around for anything she could use to defend herself. But the room was bare. Her thoughts were frantic. She couldn't fight him. He was bigger, stronger, and consumed by rage. The only thing she could do was escape. She needed to get out of the room. She needed to call for help. With a surge of adrenaline, Jessica darted toward the door. She yanked it open with all her might, but Kyle was right behind her. He grabbed her by the arm, twisting her back into the room. She let out a scream, but it was muffled as he shoved her back to the floor. "Kyle, please," she gasped, her voice desperate. "You don't have to do this. I'm your sister. I'm your family." But Kyle's eyes were cold. He didn't hear her. He didn't care. The person who had once been her brother was gone, replaced by something twisted and full of rage. With her heart pounding in her chest, Jessica fought to push him off, but her strength was fading. The blood loss from her arm was overwhelming, and the room seemed to spin around her. Her thoughts became a blur as Kyle loomed over her, the knife raised again, ready to strike. But this time, Jessica was ready. With a final burst of energy, she kicked out, hitting him hard in the chest. The force knocked him back just enough for her to scramble to her feet. Her vision blurred as she grabbed the nearest object she could find, a small vase that had been left on the dresser, and hurled it at him. The vase struck Kyle in the face, stunning him for just a moment. He staggered backward, his grip on the knife loosening slightly. Jessica's chance had come. She bolted for the door, blood dripping down her arm as she ran through the hallway, desperately trying to make it to the stairs. But as she reached the landing, her vision began to blur again. The pain from her wound was too much. She collapsed to the floor, her head spinning. She tried to cry out, but her voice was barely a whisper. "Help! Please!" The last thing she saw before everything went black was Kyle's face, standing at the top of the stairs, knife in hand, his expression one of pure rage and determination. When Jessica awoke, she was in the hospital. Her arm had been treated and the pain was now dulled by medication, but the fear was still there, gnawing at her insides. Her memories of the events were foggy, but she remembered Kyle. She remembered the way he had come after her, how he had attacked her in her own home. The confusion was overwhelming. How had it all escalated so quickly? What had caused Kyle to snap like that? Was this really the brother she had known? Sergeant Langford, a voice interrupted her thoughts. It was Detective Michael Richards, a seasoned investigator from the Clayton Police Department. He had been assigned to investigate the case, given the circumstances surrounding her injuries. Detective, Jessica said, her voice hoarse. What happened to Kyle? Did they arrest him? Detective Richards sat down beside her, his expression solemn. Your brother was found at the scene of the crime. He's been arrested and is currently in custody. We're still piecing together what happened, but from what we've gathered, this was an act of extreme violence. We're looking into the family history, and from the sounds of things, there may have been deeper issues at play. Jessica's chest tightened. What do you mean? What do you think happened? Richards hesitated, clearly trying to find the right words. We think this may have been triggered by something personal, something that Kyle was struggling with. Your sexuality, the way he reacted. It seems like this was more than just a fight. There's a lot of anger there, Jessica. Anger that may have been building up for a long time. Jessica's heart sank. She had known that Kyle had always struggled with her sexuality, but she hadn't known the extent of his anger. Had he really been harboring so much hatred for her all these years? It's possible that Kyle felt betrayed or ashamed, Richards continued. There were signs of tension in your relationship before your deployment. We're still gathering information from other family members, but it seems that this may have been the tipping point. Jessica sat up slowly, her mind racing. She had always tried to be open with her family, but she had never imagined it would lead to something like this. Kyle had been her little brother, the one she had always tried to protect, but now it seemed like she had failed to see the depth of his turmoil. Is he going to trial? She asked, her voice shaking with emotion. That's what we're working toward, Richard said softly. Right now, he's facing charges of attempted murder, but given the severity of the situation, we're looking at the possibility of a more serious charge, depending on how everything plays out. Jessica nodded, the weight of the situation settling heavily on her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but one thing was clear. Everything had changed. Her family was broken, shattered by an act of violence that she couldn't fully understand. Kyle had been her family, but now he was a stranger, consumed by something she had never seen coming. And as much as it hurt, Jessica knew that the road ahead would be a long one. She had survived the attack, but there was still so much to face. She had to reconcile with the fact that her own flesh and blood had turned on her. The pain, the confusion, and the fear would take time to heal. But one thing was certain. She would not let this define her. She would not let her brother's hatred destroy her. Jessica Langford had fought for peace in foreign lands, and now she had to fight for peace within her own heart. The days after the attack were a blur for Jessica. Her body was healing, the physical wounds starting to fade under the care of the doctors. But her mind was still trapped in the chaos. She was still trying to make sense of what had happened that night, trying to piece together the fragmented moments that had led to the violent confrontation with Kyle. Detective Michael Richards had been to visit her several times since the incident, keeping her informed about the investigation and Kyle's situation. But every time he came, Jessica found herself growing more frustrated. She needed answers, not just about what Kyle had done to her, but about why. What had driven him to this point? The police had been speaking with family members, friends, and anyone who could provide insight into Kyle's behavior over the years. Jessica's mother, Carol, was devastated by what had happened. She couldn't believe that her son, her youngest child, the one she had raised with so much love and care, could do something so monstrous. But there was more to Kyle than anyone had realized, and it was all slowly beginning to come to light. 2 days after the attack, Jessica was sitting in her hospital room when Detective Richards walked in, his face grim. Jessica, we found something, he said, his tone heavy with the weight of the news he was about to deliver. What is it? Jessica asked, her heart pounding. She had been dreading this moment, knowing that the truth would eventually come to the surface. It's about Kyle, Richards said, taking a seat beside her. We've been looking into his background, talking to people who knew him well, and we've discovered some things that might help explain what happened. Jessica felt a cold shiver run down her spine. She knew her brother had always been a little different, but she never expected to learn that he had been harboring dark secrets for so long. It turns out Kyle had been struggling with his own issues for years, issues that went beyond your relationship, Jessica, Richards continued. He had been grappling with his own identity, feelings of shame and anger about things he couldn't control. And when you came back, as a lesbian, he couldn't handle it. He saw your sexuality as a betrayal of everything he believed in. It set him off. Jessica's chest tightened. She had always known Kyle had a hard time accepting her for who she was, but she hadn't realized how deeply his feelings ran, or how much he had been suffering in silence. Had she failed him as a sister? Had her own truth pushed him into a dark, destructive place? "I don't understand," Jessica whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. "Why didn't he ever talk to me about this? Why didn't he say something? Why did he have to turn it into this violence?" Richard sighed. Kyle was never one to open up, Jessica. He kept a lot of things to himself, but we found out that he'd been attending some meetings. He'd been going to a support group for people who are trying to cure their homosexual tendencies. It's part of a group that promotes conversion therapy. Jessica's blood ran cold. She had heard of these so-called counseling groups, organizations that promise to change people's sexual orientation. She knew the harm they caused, the damage they did to vulnerable individuals who were already struggling with their identity. But to learn that Kyle had been involved in something like that, it made her sick to her stomach. "He was trying to change, trying to fight it," Richard said, his voice softening. "But his anger, it grew. And when you came back, living your truth, it was too much for him to handle. He saw your happiness, your acceptance of yourself, and he couldn't reconcile it with everything he'd been taught. It made him feel like a failure, and in his mind, that failure had to be punished." The room was silent for a long moment. Jessica's mind raced. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Her brother had been hiding behind a mask of anger and self-loathing, unable to accept who he was or who she was. And now it had led to this tragedy. It wasn't just the physical attack. It was a breaking point, a culmination of years of pain and confusion that had finally erupted into violence. That evening, Detective Richards spoke with Kyle. They had managed to get a confession from him, though it was hardly what they expected. Kyle had admitted to attacking Jessica, but his words were chillingly cold. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Kyle had said, his voice flat. "But she was the reason everything was falling apart. She made me see how much of a failure I was. I couldn't let her come back, living the way she does, thinking she could be proud of it. I couldn't let her make me feel like I was the problem." The confession sent waves of shock through the police department. Kyle's words were full of self-hatred and misplaced guilt. But even more disturbing was the fact that, deep down, he didn't seem to truly understand the magnitude of what he had done. He wasn't remorseful. He wasn't apologetic. He was still, in some way, trapped in the web of denial and anger that had festered inside him for years. The next few weeks were filled with the agony of dealing with the aftermath of the attack. Jessica had a long road to recovery, both physically and emotionally. Her wound from the knife was healing, but the emotional scars ran much deeper. She had never anticipated that her relationship with her brother would end in violence. She had hoped that one day he would understand her, accept her for who she was. But that dream had shattered in an instant. Her family was torn apart. Her mother, Carol, was devastated, unable to comprehend how her son could have done something so brutal to his own sister. But at the same time, there was a strange sense of relief. Carol had always known there was tension between her children, but the truth about Kyle's struggles had been hidden from everyone until now. And even though Carol's heart ached for Kyle, she also knew that the family could never go back to the way things were. As Jessica began therapy to cope with the trauma, she started to make sense of her own emotions. The pain from the attack was still fresh, but the anger and confusion that had clouded her mind began to dissipate. She couldn't change what had happened, but she could choose how to move forward. She could choose to reclaim her life. Detective Richards kept her updated on the investigation, and Kyle was eventually charged with attempted murder. But it wasn't just the legal consequences that Jessica had to face. She had to grapple with the guilt she felt, guilt that her brother had been in so much pain and that she hadn't seen it sooner. But as time passed, Jessica began to understand something important. She couldn't carry the weight of Kyle's actions on her shoulders. His hatred, his anger. It wasn't her fault. It wasn't her responsibility to fix him. She had tried to love him, to help him, but in the end, it was his own demons that he couldn't escape. Jessica Langford's journey toward healing was just beginning. But one thing was certain. She was stronger than she had ever been before. She had survived the worst of it, and now it was time for her to reclaim her life, to continue living her truth without fear. Her family might never be the same, and her relationship with Kyle might be broken forever. But Jessica knew one thing. She was worthy of love, acceptance, and peace, and she would never let anyone take that away from her again. Weeks passed, and the weight of what had happened to Jessica continued to linger. The physical healing from the wound on her arm had been slow but steady. She had regular visits to the doctor, and each time, the doctor would remind her how fortunate she was that the knife hadn't done more damage. But the emotional wounds, the ones that ran deeper than anything her body had endured, were still raw. She had always been a strong, independent woman, having served proudly in the military, facing down danger in a faraway country. But this was different. This was her own brother, someone she had shared memories with, someone she had grown up with, attacking her because of something she couldn't control. Her sexuality, the shame, anger, and guilt she felt were overwhelming, and it was hard to admit even to herself that she still didn't understand why Kyle had snapped. It wasn't just the attack, it was the years of silence, the years of harboring hatred and fear, and now the consequences were too far gone to reverse. Her family had been left in a state of paralysis. Her mother, Carol, was devastated, torn between her love for Jessica and her sense of guilt over Kyle's actions. It was as though she was walking on eggshells in her own home, unsure of how to address the situation. There were no easy answers. Carol would occasionally bring up the idea of seeing a family counselor, but it was always met with a quiet rejection. The rift between them, between Jessica and Kyle, was so deep that it felt impossible to bridge. Jessica had tried to reach out to her mother. She loved her, and she understood that this wasn't easy for anyone. But every time they spoke, it was as though a thick wall separated them, as though neither knew how to approach the wreckage Kyle had caused. The worst part? Jessica had found herself doubting if her mother could ever truly accept who she was. Her sexuality had always been a point of tension, but the attack had shifted everything in a way Jessica couldn't explain. She had spent years hiding parts of herself in the hope of maintaining peace, but now there was no going back. She wasn't ashamed of who she was, not anymore, but the cost of living her truth had been more than she had ever imagined. Despite the storm of emotions at home, Jessica tried to keep a normal routine. She kept herself busy, focusing on work, on getting back into her life. Her superiors had offered her a desk job, a position in administration that she could do from home. But it didn't feel like enough. It didn't feel like her. She spent hours researching various nonprofit organizations, working with those in need, especially veterans who struggled with PTSD and other after effects of war. She had always been drawn to helping others, but in the wake of the attack, it seemed more important than ever. Perhaps it was a way for her to reclaim her sense of purpose. The routine of being busy, of working towards something bigger, something good, became her lifeline. She also began attending therapy regularly, something that her doctor had recommended. The sessions were hard at first, painful even, as she relived the details of the attack and the fear that had surged through her when Kyle lunged at her with the knife. But as the weeks went by, she started to feel something shifting. The weight of the trauma, though heavy, was starting to ease. She found herself facing the memories, even the darkest ones, with the realization that she was still standing. That realization, her resilience, was what kept her going. She was stronger than she gave herself credit for, but that didn't mean everything was easy. The criminal case against Kyle moved slowly through the court system. Jessica had been informed by Detective Richards that Kyle was facing a charge of attempted murder, but he hadn't been officially charged yet. There were still investigations into his mental state, interviews with experts who could determine whether he was fit to stand trial. What troubled Jessica most was Kyle's state of mind. She had known him her entire life. He had always been sensitive, but the anger in his eyes when he attacked her, that was something new, something dark. He hadn't shown any signs of being violent before, at least not to this extreme. It left Jessica wondering, had he been hiding his true feelings all these years, festering in silence, waiting for the right moment to explode? One evening, while flipping through some old family photo albums, Jessica found an old picture of her and Kyle at their childhood home. She was laughing, her arm around him. They looked so happy, so connected. The image felt like a world away from the reality she was now living. She stared at it for what felt like an eternity, asking herself how they had gotten from there to here. She was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Carol. "Hey, honey," her mother said softly, stepping inside. "Can we talk?" Jessica looked up from the photo album and nodded. "Sure, Mom. What's on your mind?" Carol walked over to Jessica's bed and sat down beside her hands folded in her lap. "I've been thinking a lot about what happened. About Kyle." She hesitated, the words catching in her throat. "I don't know what's going on with him, Jessica. He's not the same person. He's been so angry, and I feel like I should have seen the signs. I should have done something." Jessica shook her head. "Mom, you couldn't have known. He kept everything inside. No one knew how much he was struggling. But still, I should have been there for him," Carol said, tears welling up in her eyes. "I should have supported him better. Maybe if I had been more present, if I hadn't been so blind, none of this would have happened." "Don't blame yourself," Jessica said, her voice steady, but it hurt to hear her mother so broken. "This isn't your fault. Kyle made his choices. You can't control that." Carol nodded, wiping away a tear. "I just wish I had known. I wish I could have done something." Jessica reached over and took her mother's hand. "We'll figure this out, Mom. I'm here. We're still family, even if things feel broken right now. But we need time. Time to heal, to understand what happened." The silence between them was heavy, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that marked the beginning of a difficult conversation, a starting point for something that could never truly be repaired, but could perhaps, in time, be understood. As time went on, the family tried to piece together what they could. The upcoming trial was a looming presence, and Jessica found herself dreading it. She knew she would have to face Kyle in court, and she didn't know if she could do it. She didn't know if she could look at the man who had once been her brother, the man who had been consumed by hate, and find a way to forgive him for what he had done. The scars he had left on her, physical and emotional, were not something that could easily be healed, but she had no choice. She would go through the trial, and she would continue to heal. For herself, for her family, and for the truth. As the days dragged on, the anticipation of Kyle's trial weighed heavily on Jessica. The court dates had been set, and the closer the day came, the more Jessica found herself questioning whether she was prepared for what was to come. The pain, the anger, the betrayal, it all felt like too much to bear. But she had no choice. She had to face her brother, and she had to make sure that justice was served for everything he had done. In the weeks leading up to the trial, Jessica found herself wrestling with her emotions. She spent hours in therapy, talking through her feelings of guilt and betrayal, trying to make sense of why Kyle had attacked her, why he had let his hatred boil over into violence. She still couldn't fully understand it. How had her own flesh and blood become a stranger in her life? Someone who would do the unthinkable to her, the person he had grown up with. It made no sense. But as the trial loomed, Jessica knew she had to prepare herself. This wouldn't just be a chance to get justice for herself. It was a chance to stop Kyle from hurting anyone else. A chance to hold him accountable for the attack, for the years of anger and self-hatred that had festered inside him. The day of the trial arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Jessica's family sat quietly in the audience, her mother Carol, a nervous wreck beside her. Kyle's face was calm, too calm. His defense attorney was a sharp, experienced lawyer, and she had managed to arrange a plea bargain, but Jessica wasn't interested in the deals being made behind closed doors. She wanted to hear it all. She wanted to see Kyle face the consequences of his actions. Detective Richards had prepared Jessica for what would happen in the courtroom, and he had made sure she knew what she would be asked to testify about. He explained that they would focus on the attack, the events of that night, and how Kyle had reacted. The defense would likely argue that Kyle wasn't fully in control of his actions, that he had been overwhelmed by emotion and mental health issues. They would try to make him appear as the victim of his own mind, someone who couldn't help his violent impulses. But Jessica wasn't going to let that happen. She couldn't. The prosecutor stood first, presenting their case against Kyle. They had gathered all the evidence, including the testimony from Jessica, from the doctors who had treated her, and from the police. The attack had been brutal, without provocation. Kyle had not been acting in self-defense. He had been acting out of deep-seated anger, which had been bubbling beneath the surface for years. The prosecutor made sure to highlight the damage Kyle had done, not just physically but emotionally. He had betrayed Jessica's trust, and he had left her with wounds that would take much longer to heal. Jessica's heart was pounding in her chest as the prosecutor called her to the stand. She had known this moment would come, but now that it was here, the reality of it felt overwhelming. She had never wanted to be in the spotlight, never wanted her pain to be something others had to witness, but she knew it was necessary. She had to stand up for herself, for what had been taken from her. As she walked to the witness stand, she tried to steady her breath. The room was silent, save for the rustling of papers and the shuffle of feet as she sat down in front of the judge. She could feel everyone's eyes on her, but she focused on the task ahead. She couldn't let fear stop her now. The prosecutor stood in front of her, asking her to recount the events of that night. Jessica spoke slowly at first, her voice shaking. She described Kyle's behavior, how he had come to her room with the knife, how the situation had escalated so quickly, how she had tried to reason with him, only for him to turn violent. She explained how she had tried to get away, how she had bolted for the door, only to be dragged back into the room. She described the terror she had felt when Kyle had come at her with the knife, the sharp pain as it had slashed across her arm. The room was quiet as she spoke, the weight of her words sinking in. As Jessica finished her testimony, she felt a sense of relief, but also a deep sadness. She had never imagined that it would come to this, that she would have to stand in a courtroom and describe the attack in such detail in front of everyone. But it was done now. She had said her piece. The defense was next. Kyle's attorney stood up and made her case. She argued that Kyle had been struggling with mental health issues for years, that his anger had been building, and that the attack was a result of his inability to control his emotions. The defense called experts to testify that Kyle's actions were likely the result of unresolved trauma, that his deep-rooted guilt over his feelings about Jessica's sexuality had caused a mental breakdown. Jessica listened carefully, but the defense's argument only angered her. They were trying to paint Kyle as the victim, as someone who had been pushed to the brink by his emotions, by his inability to accept her. They were minimizing the severity of his actions, trying to excuse what he had done because of some perceived emotional struggle. But Jessica knew better. This wasn't just about mental health. This was about Kyle's hatred, his refusal to accept her for who she was. When it was Kyle's turn to take the stand, Jessica held her breath. She had been dreading this moment, seeing him again, hearing him speak after everything that had happened. He looked different now, older somehow. His face was still calm, but his eyes were distant, filled with something that Jessica couldn't place. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "I didn't mean to hurt her," Kyle said, his voice low. "I wasn't myself. I wasn't thinking. I couldn't control the anger I felt. She made me feel ashamed of myself. I was angry. I didn't want to be angry, but I couldn't stop it. And then, when she came back, being so proud of herself, so confident, I couldn't stand it." Jessica's heart sank as she listened to him. He wasn't even apologizing. He wasn't acknowledging the pain he had caused. Instead, he was still trying to blame her for his actions, for his inability to accept her. He was still trapped in his own self-hatred, still refusing to see the truth. The defense tried to argue for leniency, suggesting that Kyle needed therapy, that he wasn't a danger to society, that he had been overwhelmed by personal struggles. But Jessica knew the truth. Kyle had chosen to hurt her. He had chosen violence. And no matter what he had been through, no matter what struggles he had faced, that couldn't be excused. The trial lasted for several days, each moment heavier than the last. As the jury deliberated, Jessica found herself wrestling with conflicting emotions. She felt anger, sadness, even pity for Kyle, but she knew that no matter what happened, she couldn't let him off the hook for what he had done. When the verdict finally came, Jessica was sitting in the courtroom, her hands trembling. The jury found Kyle guilty of attempted murder. They recommended a sentence that would include both prison time and mandatory therapy. It wasn't the death sentence she had once imagined in her anger, but it was justice. Kyle would be held accountable for his actions. As the judge banged the gavel, Jessica felt a strange sense of finality. This chapter of her life was over. She had survived the attack, and now she was free to move forward, even if the scars remained. Kyle had been punished for what he did, but Jessica knew that her healing, her true healing, would come from within. She walked out of the courtroom with her head held high. It wasn't the closure she had hoped for, but it was a step toward finding peace. Kyle had made his choices, and now it was time for her to reclaim her life. The days following the trial were difficult, filled with conflicting emotions that Jessica couldn't quite make sense of. The court decision had brought some measure of closure. Kyle had been convicted and sentenced, though part of her felt a quiet, hollow sense of relief rather than satisfaction. The truth was, the wounds from that night ran deeper than just the physical pain. It was the betrayal, the devastating realization that her brother had become someone she no longer recognized. Kyle was no longer the person she'd grown up with. The attack had severed their relationship in a way that felt irreversible. Still, Jessica had to move forward. She couldn't afford to let herself drown in anger or regret. Her life had to continue, and she had no choice but to rebuild, brick by brick, as she sought the healing she so desperately needed. One of the first things Jessica did after the trial was to meet with her therapist, Dr. Eliza Harper, who had been a steady presence in the weeks following the attack. Dr. Harper had guided her through some of the darkest moments, helping her process the trauma while teaching her tools to cope with the grief and pain. "How are you holding up, Jessica?" Dr. Harper asked one afternoon as they sat across from each other in the warm, cozy office, sunlight streaming through the windows. Jessica leaned back, her fingers intertwined. "I'm not sure," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "I thought I'd feel more something. I don't know, but I don't feel relieved or free. I just feel lost." Dr. Harper nodded thoughtfully, a gentle understanding in her expression. "You've been through an unimaginable ordeal. It's normal to feel like there's a void after such a traumatic event. It's going to take time. The healing process is never linear, Jessica. It's okay to not feel like yourself right now." Jessica sighed, looking out the window at the small patch of green grass in front of the building. "I don't know where to start, Dr. Harper. I feel like everything is broken. My relationship with my family, my relationship with myself. How do I move forward when everything feels fractured?" Dr. Harper's voice was calm and steady. "The first step is acknowledging the pain, which you're already doing. Healing begins with understanding that your feelings are valid, that you have every right to feel hurt, angry, confused. But that doesn't mean you have to stay there forever." Jessica nodded slowly, absorbing Dr. Harper's words. "But how do I forgive Kyle?" she asked, her voice almost a whisper. "How do I forgive him for what he did to me? How do I heal from the fact that my own brother, someone I loved, tried to kill me?" Dr. Harper paused, allowing Jessica the space to process the question. "Forgiveness is a complex thing, Jessica. It's not something that happens overnight, and it's not something you owe anyone, especially someone who hurt you deeply. Forgiveness is about freeing yourself from the pain, not for them, but for you. It's about accepting that you can't change the past, but you can choose how you move forward." Jessica sat in silence, the weight of Dr. Harper's words sinking in. She had always believed in forgiveness, had always been the one to smooth over arguments with friends or family, even when things weren't easy. But this was different. Kyle's actions had shattered something inside her that she wasn't sure could ever be repaired. How could she ever forgive him for what he had done? "I don't know if I'll ever be able to forgive him," Jessica said softly, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "I don't even know if I want to." Dr. Harper smiled gently, her tone reassuring. And that's okay. Forgiveness isn't an obligation. It's a personal choice, and it's not a requirement for healing. What's important is that you give yourself permission to feel whatever you need to feel. It's okay to not have all the answers. It's okay to be angry. Just don't let that anger consume you. Don't let it define your future. Jessica took a deep breath, a slight sense of relief washing over her. For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had permission to be human, to feel the depth of her hurt without having to justify it. It was okay to not have everything figured out. It was okay to be angry. It was okay to be broken. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of small steps, each one adding up to something bigger. Jessica resumed her volunteer work with veterans groups, something she had always been passionate about. The work was fulfilling, but it also provided a sense of purpose that Jessica needed. Helping others, especially those who had faced their own battles, gave her perspective, reminding her that pain didn't have to define someone's life. She began to focus on rebuilding her life, one day at a time. She went on long runs in the park, allowing the rhythmic pounding of her feet against the pavement to release the tension in her body. She spent time with friends she had made during her deployment, those who had seen the darkest parts of the world and still found ways to live with hope. They had all experienced some form of trauma, and their understanding of what she was going through helped her process her own journey. But even in the moments of healing, Jessica couldn't escape the fact that her family was still fractured. Her mother was doing her best to be supportive, but the silence between them was uncomfortable, and the guilt in Carol's eyes never went away. Jessica knew her mother was struggling to reconcile her love for both her children, but it wasn't something Jessica could fix. They both needed time, time to process the event, time to heal, time that neither of them had expected to need. As for Kyle, his trial was a painful reminder of everything they had lost. His defense team had pushed for a lighter sentence, citing his mental health struggles and his involvement in conversion therapy as factors that contributed to his violent outburst. Kyle had been sentenced to time in a psychiatric facility where he would receive treatment for his anger and emotional issues. But to Jessica, it felt like nothing more than a temporary solution. There would never be true closure, not until Kyle confronted his own demons and came to terms with what he had done. One evening, months after the trial, Jessica received a letter from Kyle. It was handwritten and it wasn't long, but it was enough to make her stomach churn. She opened the envelope cautiously, unsure of what to expect. Jessica, I don't expect you to ever forgive me. I wouldn't forgive myself either. What I did to you, I can't take it back, and I can't explain it. I don't know what happened to me. All I can say is I'm sorry. I've been trying to understand why I did it, but I know I'll never understand the damage I caused. Please know that I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make things right, even though I know I'll never be able to undo what I've done. I love you, Jess. Always have. Always will. Kyle. Jessica sat quietly for a moment, the letter trembling in her hands. She didn't know how to respond. She had spent so many months trying to find peace, and now Kyle's words stirred up feelings she wasn't ready to confront. She felt a flicker of something, perhaps relief, or maybe even sadness. But it wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. As the tears began to fall, Jessica realized that her healing was still a work in progress. But for the first time, she didn't feel so lost. She knew the road ahead would be long, but she was ready to face it. She was ready to keep going. Jessica Langford sat by the window of her small apartment, staring out at the vibrant orange and pink hues of the setting sun. The world outside seemed to move on without a second thought, but inside she still carried the weight of the past year, of everything she had endured and survived. Healing wasn't a linear process. It wasn't a destination, but a journey, one that was still ongoing. The pain of the attack, the loss of her relationship with Kyle, and the slow rebuild of her family had all left their marks. But Jessica was learning to live with them, to move forward despite the scars. The letter from Kyle, though painful, had been a turning point. She had read it over and over, unsure of how to process his words. His apology, his acknowledgement of the violence he had inflicted, hadn't brought the closure she thought it would. It hadn't erased the trauma or made things right. But there was something raw in his words, something that made her believe that, in some distant part of him, he truly regretted what had happened. She didn't know if forgiveness was possible, But she knew that she couldn't let anger or resentment control her life any longer. For her own healing, she had to release it. Kyle was receiving treatment at a psychiatric facility, and the letters between them, while few, were slowly opening a small window of communication. She had responded once, carefully, acknowledging his apology but making it clear that while she appreciated it, it didn't change the past. She wasn't ready for reconciliation, but she wasn't completely closing the door either. She didn't know if she could ever truly forgive him, but the fact that she was even considering the possibility felt like progress. The months passed, and Jessica kept moving forward. She focused on her work with the Veterans Organization, something that had always been a source of comfort for her. Helping others, listening to their stories of trauma and recovery, gave her perspective and strength. She began to find purpose in being a support for those who understood the weight of mental and emotional wounds just as she did. It was a quiet kind of healing, but it worked. As part of her recovery process, she also began to explore new interests. She enrolled in a photography class at the local community center, something she had always wanted to try but had never found the time for. The creative outlet gave her a sense of peace, a break from the heaviness that often clouded her mind. She found joy in capturing moments of beauty, in seeing the world through a lens that was no longer clouded by fear or anger. One evening, as Jessica sat in a cafe with a group of friends she had made through her volunteer work, she felt something shift within her. She had spent so much time focused on the trauma and the pain, on the betrayal and the violence. But in that moment, surrounded by laughter and warmth, she realized that she was starting to live again. She wasn't defined by the attack, by Kyle's actions, or by the fractured parts of her past. She was more than that. For the first time in a long while, she allowed herself to smile, genuinely and without hesitation. But as much as she had worked toward healing, the past continued to linger, especially in her relationship with her mother. Carol had been attending therapy on her own, trying to process the guilt and the confusion over Kyle's actions. Jessica appreciated that her mother was taking the time to understand the complexity of the situation, but it was still hard. The silence between them remained, even as they sat together in the same room. Jessica didn't want to push her mother too hard, but at the same time, she knew that nothing would heal if they didn't address it. They had to rebuild their relationship too. It wasn't just about Kyle, it was about the family as a whole. One evening after dinner, Jessica asked her mother if they could talk. Carol looked up from the dishes, sensing the seriousness in Jessica's tone. She nodded, her face softening with concern. "Mom," Jessica began, "we need to talk about everything. About Kyle, about me, about us." Carol's eyes filled with hesitation. "I know," she said quietly, wiping her hands on the dish towel. "I've been afraid to have this conversation with you, Jess. I don't know what to say. I don't know how to fix what's been broken." Jessica felt a pang in her chest. It had been so hard to address the divide between them, but she knew they couldn't heal unless they had this conversation. "We don't have to fix everything, Mom. I just want us to understand each other. I need to know that you see me, that you see who I am." Carol sat down at the kitchen table, her hands clasped in front of her. "I do see you, Jessica, but I think I've been so focused on Kyle, on trying to fix him, that I've neglected you. I'm so sorry for that. I don't know how to make it right." Jessica reached out, taking her mother's hand. "It's okay, Mom. I don't need you to make it right. I just need you to be here with me, to not let this break us apart. We can't change what happened with Kyle, but we can still have a future together, a new future." For the first time in months, Jessica saw a glimmer of hope in her mother's eyes. The sadness that had weighed on Carol's face seemed to lift, just slightly. "I want that too, Jess. I don't want to lose you." "I'm not going anywhere, Mom," Jessica said, her voice steady. "But we need to start fresh. We need to rebuild." Carol nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'll do whatever it takes." The process of rebuilding didn't happen overnight. There were still painful moments, awkward silences, quiet confrontations, but slowly, Jessica and her mother began to heal. They spent more time together, talking about their shared memories, their hopes for the future, and the things they had never said to each other.